Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is April 4, 2022. This past weekend, I pulled a bunch of video clips for what I call the Hangin' with the Sockdem Gang video series. I haven't done them in a while, but basically every month or two, I go over to Kyle Kulinski Secular Talks channel. I click on the Related Channels tab. I look at the people that he's linking to, and then I go through their videos to see if there's anything, from the last few weeks that looks like it might make an interesting basis for a response video from a Marxist perspective. So, not every channel that Kyle Kulinski links to is what I would term Sockdem Gang. Exactly. I mean, Sockdem Gang, it kind of came out of channels that supported Bernie Sanders, stuff like that. People who push social democracy and, have kind of made a name for themselves in the 2010s. Some of them, though, are more in the rightward drifting, quote, populist crowd. You can see, for example, Jimmy Dore, Kim Iverson, Nico House, and I would definitely put Joe Rogan in that category. Constantly has on right and far right guests and does not have the emotional maturity or intellectual capacity to really critically analyze what they're saying. It's all kind of seat of the pants, intuitive stuff. And anyway, Rogan is not a smart person. I remember watching the David Lee Roth interview that Rogan did. It was just, man, Roth is not a brain surgeon, but he's definitely a clever and witty guy. He was the singer of Van Halen in the late 70s and early 80s. Very charismatic figure. I mean, whatever his personal problems are, very entertaining guy, full of interesting little witticisms and whatever. And watching Rogan try to keep up with him, I mean, it was honestly sad. Roth would be going on about how, he went to Japan and studied meditation and this and that. And he'd be going on for a while and talking about all this stuff. And then it would go back to Rogan for another question to keep the conversation alive. It would literally be like, so you were like in a band. I mean, if you've ever seen the Chris Farley show, those clips from SNL where Chris Farley would, as a bit, try to interview famous people really badly, it kind of reminded me of that. But David Lee Roth is an entertainer, like Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is a bad comedian. So that's an appropriate interview for him to do, and he can do it badly, and it doesn't really have massive consequences for society. I really wouldn't be covering him if, that was the case, if he stuck to people in his field. But what he's doing is platforming people who have political ideas, who are backed by who knows who, and he utterly lacks the ability to engage critically with them. That is, if he even has the desire to do so. Enter Michael Shellenberger. This guy's been around for about 20 years, co-authoring books about environmental topics, which are, well, trash. And more recently, he has been running for governor of California. In the last race, he finished in 9th place, garnering tens of thousands of votes in a race where the winner won millions of votes. But he's young-ish, and he does get propped up by shows like Joe Rogan. He goes on Fox News, places like that. So clearly, some political interests see this guy as possibly useful to them if they hype him up enough and if the following grows enough, etc. So recently, a clip appeared on the Joe Rogan show of a portion of the interview that he did with Joe Rogan. And the title of the clip is Michael Shellenberger's Solution for the Homeless Problem in California. Not the housing crisis, the homeless problem. So Schellenberger now has moved from kind of climate denial type stuff. Basically, it's like technology will save us from global warming. But I don't want to just reduce it to that because the message, I think, is a lot more insidious than that. So we'll just leave that aside for now. He's been a part of multiple books that have attempted to really skew the discourse about climate change, and again, that's for another time, its own video. But because he's running for governor, he has decided to take on the, quote, homeless problem, and basically saying that It's not a question of rent. It's not a question of poverty. It's not a question of housing cost. It's just people are doing drugs, and other states are shipping people who do drugs to California, dragging down California. It's like, imagine every reactionary, reality denying talking point you could come up with related to housing. This guy is right there spouting it. So we're not going to show the clip. However, the clip I will cite as putting this on my radar. What we will do is we will read his piece that he wrote on his Medium blog or whatever. Honestly, I just don't want to put the clip on the channel. It's not really something I feel like platforming. Joe Rogan has a big enough audience as it is. But we will read Shellenberger's positions expressed in his own words. Then I will follow this with a response article from the American Prospect, which goes into a lot of detail talking about why he's wrong. And then I will go into my own response, because you really don't have to look very hard to see that there is a gigantic problem with housing in the United States. You know, whether or not some right-wing dipshit is trying to run for governor off of it. So, about that, who is Schellenberger trying to appeal to with his very, so far, unsuccessful attempts to run for governor? Well, it's right in the first line of his blog. The entry is from March 14. It's titled, "Why We Will Save California and Why We Must Have the Courage to Care." So this is sort of like a tough love framing, usually just a cover for a lack of compassion. So the courage to care. We must have the courage to do horrible things, basically. Like a lot of Californians, I have a full and happy life. My wife and I own a home in the Berkeley Hills, from which we enjoy watching the fog roll underneath the Golden Gate Bridge and blanket the bay. Our children are healthy and happy. We enjoy comfortable lives, seemingly far from the chaos and suffering in California's downtowns. But over the last few years, the rising chaos and suffering have increasingly troubled me. Pause. Who is he appealing to? He is appealing to the wealthy, everything's great, I love my life crowd. Okay, no wonder he didn't get far, because that is not the way most people feel. That is not most people's lives. Most people in this country cannot afford a $500 to $1,000 emergency. People are not generally just waking up in the morning, I have a full and happy life, we own a home in the Berkeley Hills, we love watching the fog roll in under the Golden Gate Bridge, our children are perfect, and blah, blah, blah. Everything's comfortable. Everything's great. And by the way, you know, these cities are getting out of control. We need to do something about that. Get rid of all these homeless people. What the fuck, man? What the fuck? It's fucking up my perfect life. Looking at people who don't have it as good as I do. What the fuck? That's basically who he's appealing to here. There aren't that many people like that. So you're not going to get too far. Still, this guy got an audience on Joe Rogan, which of course is going to catapult him beyond the reasonable levels of attention that he should be receiving. You know, in a capitalist society, money can really propel things a lot further than they should. There are some limits to that, but remember, you know, there's really no shortage of right-wing politicians that take hold, despite the fact that their views are completely out of touch with most people. That's just not how U.S. politics works. It tends to be who spends the most money wins the election. So one never knows. All right, continuing. In 2018, I ran for governor to make the case for abundant housing to address homelessness. In 2019, I called for a state of emergency on homelessness and mandatory psychiatric care or rehab for addicts and the mentally ill who break the law. Pausing, there's a lot going on in that paragraph. Even more in the next sentence. And in 2021, I co-founded a statewide coalition with parents of homeless drug addicts, parents of children killed by fentanyl, and recovering addicts to advocate for a statewide psychiatric and addiction care system, CalPsych, a crackdown on open-air and online drug markets, and a change from the state's de facto camp anywhere policy to a ban on illegal camping. So, tons going on here. First, we've got making the case for abundant housing, then basically calling for locking more people up and prohibiting illegal camping, etc. So, I don't even know where to begin with this. Schellenberger is not an expert on homelessness. That's not his background. He is a rich guy who doesn't like looking at homeless people, as is the case with many people who take the kind of tack that he is doing. But also, right here, we're seeing a kind of contradiction which is characteristic of his work. So recently he wrote a book called San Fransicko, How Progressives Destroy American Cities, or something like that, which should tell you a lot about his political background and the kind of people that he is trying to rally in this political crusade. But so is it about housing, or is it about mental illness and drug abuse? Because he claims the first, that we need more housing, and then switches immediately to actually it's just a problem of drug addiction and mental illness. Well, these are conflicting messages, and he's kind of kept both going for a while. Again, this is a wannabe politician doing sort of wannabe libertarian, in-your-face style stuff, and very attention-grabbing, very over the top. But then when you try to break it down, any point that he might possibly be trying to make, it's couched in such inflammatory language that it's really impossible to kind of break it down. However, I was going to get into this later in the video. Let's go now, before we go any further into the madness that is this blog post, into a response from Ned Resnikoff. This is January 24, 2022. Resnikoff is publishing here for the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative at the University of California, San Francisco. So people do study homelessness and housing policy and things like this. Back in college, I took an entire course in it myself. What we learned is that the things that are best supported by the research about homelessness is that the three major causes of it. And prior to the neoliberal era, homelessness as a mass phenomenon did not really exist. There's been a long tradition of sort of wandering ascetics, but this is very few people who sort of live a life of, being transient. And then there are people who are migrant workers and things like that. That's a little bit different. But as far as just people who are staying in one place and, otherwise would just live in a house or an apartment or something, who can't get one, this is a new phenomenon. Prior to that, there would be skid rows. There would be, very cheap places for people to live, single room occupancies or flop houses, things like that. If you've ever seen the movie Big, the place that Tom Hanks' character stays in when he becomes an adult, those things got torn down as part of gentrification. Gentrification being the number one cause of the housing crisis and the phenomenon of homelessness today. This is where upscale housing, being more profitable for the people the capitalists who own it, basically low-income housing, affordable housing, flop houses, whatever, get torn down, and then upscale stuff gets put in. It's just more profitable for the people who own it. But it's not affordable for the people who used to live in the cheaper stuff. So that is cause number one. Number two, deindustrialization, globalization, shipping the jobs out, all that kind of stuff. Just people not having jobs. Then you, in a money-based economy, can't afford housing. So that would be cause number two. And third, cuts in social benefits. Basically, so number one, housing becomes more expensive due to gentrification. Number two, deindustrialization. People are losing the jobs, and then the kinds of jobs that take their place, more service sector stuff. It's less unionization, fewer benefits, etc., just lower wages overall. And then cuts in social benefits. So, programs that used to make up the slack getting cut along with the pay. So you got pay and government aid both getting cut. So these are the three major causes of homelessness. basically a lack of cheap housing. And then, can you afford the more expensive stuff? No, you can't, because the jobs are different than they were back in the 70s and earlier. And the social programs aren't there as the kind of safety net. So additional causes include deinstitutionalization, happened around the same time in the 70s. This is a contributing factor, but it's not a major one. Specifically, it is limited to people with more severe mental illness who used to be housed in institutions, and there were a lot of problems with that. But once put out in the world, especially in the neoliberal context of, just less social support, smaller safety nets, things like that, tended to not necessarily be able to deal well in the economy and would wind up falling through the cracks and becoming homeless. Second, and tied to the general question of mental illness, substance abuse and addiction. This can be really life destabilizing, really once somebody's in the throes, every other priority, because the substance is so distorting to your mind, every other priority just falls by the wayside. People wind up just violating, their basic priorities in life, relationships, jobs, etc. But I mean, this is part of mental illness. However, it's often ignorantly viewed as, people's own fault, things like that. So although it is a mental health issue, it's people suffering from substance abuse problems are often viewed as less deserving, and so they become prime targets for this kind of victim-blaming conservative propaganda that Schellenberger's putting out. So again, it's a contributing factor, but it's not a structural causal problem. Likewise, family problems and also work problems, unemployment. Now, we mentioned deindustrialization. That's a major structural change in the U.S. economy. That seems to be tied to the rise of homelessness as a mass phenomenon. Unemployment per se, not so much. Unemployment will tend to lead to increased poverty. But again, try to view the homelessness issue as a housing crisis issue, because that's what it is. It's a lack of housing. Either an absolute lack of there are not structures that are residential units, or there is a lack of housing that people can actually afford. So either way, it's a lack of housing that is accessible to people in need of housing. That's fundamentally the thing. So these things that are more on an individual level, whether it's, more severe mental illness or substance abuse or family problems and things like that, these are things on the individual level which can make a person more predisposed to falling into the cracks, in the society. But the cracks are part of the structure, and that's the point. And if we didn't have the cracks, then even people who are more vulnerable would not be falling into them because they wouldn't be there. So that's the point. It's that people who are at risk because there are risks in the system, which could be removed. So that's the important thing to understand here. All right, so that said, let's get into the Resnikoff piece. San Fransicko is incorrect about housing affordability and homelessness. The most influential and widely read book about homelessness to be released in the past year is undoubtedly San Fransicko, Why Progressives Ruin Cities. Comment, kind of reminds me a little bit of the Caleb Maupin, The Left Are Destroyers. Anyway, a lot of fascist adjacent stuff going on there. Anyway, continuing. Amazon currently lists the book at both number 1 and number 4 for the hardcover and Kindle editions, respectively, on its list of bestsellers in the urban and regional economics category. Author Michael Shellenberger has been interviewed on the Joe Rogan Experience, one of the most popular podcasts in the world. His book has been reviewed in the New York Times and cited in the Washington Post. It's a testament to the book's popularity that I placed a library hold on it almost 3 months ago and was only able to pick it up last week. I felt it would be worth the wait, given that much of San Fransicko is a direct challenge to the housing first model of addressing homelessness. It seemed worthy of serious engagement. I should note that the book also repeatedly criticizes BHHI's director, Margaret Kuschel, by name, as the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative. In the interest of full disclosure, let me add that in response to an earlier post on this blog, Mr. Schellenberger accused me of lying and bullying journalists. I encourage you to read the offending post for yourself, linked here, to judge whether he's correct. I always aim for courtesy and professionalism when writing this blog or speaking to reporters, although it's certainly possible that I sometimes miss the mark. I described San Fransicko as a book about homelessness, but that's not quite right. While much of the book is dedicated to discussing the homelessness crisis in West Coast cities, its ambitions are much broader than that. There are chapters about urban crime rates and policing, substance use disorder and harm reduction, the cult leader Jim Jones. What? A short chapter that summarizes the entire history of psychiatry, and some rather surreal digressions into critiques of Marx and Foucault. Comment, so in other words, fascist ravings. Continuing, most of these topics are well outside my wheelhouse, so I'm going to confine this post to a discussion of something about which I do know a thing or two, the link between housing unaffordability and homelessness. Challenging the evidence of this link is central to Shellenberger's project in San Francisco. Counter to the expert consensus that America's homelessness crisis is primarily fueled by stagnant incomes and out-of-control housing costs. Comment, we have covered this on the channel before. I guess I'll make a playlist for housing stuff, but yeah, this is absolutely true. Like, housing prices rose like 30% in 2021 alone, for example. That's not, like, that's a fact, okay? That's material reality. Continuing. Schellenberger asserts that the bigger issue is a combination of rampant substance use disorder, mental illness, and a climate of decadent moral permissiveness in liberal cities. This assertion, made early in the book, is a key to nearly everything that follows. Schellenberger's argument. San Fransicko's argument against housing unaffordability as the primary driver of homelessness can be summarized as follows. 1. Homelessness in West Coast cities rose during a period when homelessness nationwide was declining. Other cities, such as Chicago and the metropolitan areas of Miami and Atlanta, saw significant declines even as Bay Area homelessness rose precipitously. 2. Other cities with expensive housing, Schellenberger cites Palo Alto and Beverly Hills, do not have San Francisco's homelessness problem. Comment, you're going to cite Beverly Hills? Holy shit. Okay. 3. The empirical research... Beverly Hills, you're citing. Okay. The empirical research on housing unaffordability and homelessness is less clear than Housing First advocates suggest. For example, an oft-cited Zillow study has been widely misinterpreted. 4. Homeless people are disproportionately likely to suffer from debilitating behavioral health problems, including substance use disorder. These conditions must have caused their homelessness. That is roughly the order in which these claims first show up in the book. I already addressed number 4 in the earlier blog post that invoked Schellenberger's ire, so I'll only add that it's well known among homeless service providers that, as one group of researchers put it, quote, the association between homelessness and drug use is bidirectional, unquote. Pre-existing substance use issues or behavioral disorders can certainly make it harder to retain stable housing. Conversely, bouts of homelessness can be so traumatizing that they have ruinous effects on one's mental health or can lead one to self-medicate. Schellenberger takes a shortcut to a tidy causal inference when the reality is far messier. Comment, I just want to add there, I've heard other researchers point out convincingly that, I mean, what is said here is very accurate and apt, that the trauma of, not knowing if you're going to have somewhere to live and all the things that happen on the streets, people get robbed all the time or even beaten while they're homeless, like horrible things happen. And your general view of the society that allowed this to happen to you definitely darkens during that. It can really have devastating effects on mental health, and it can lead to drinking or, other substance abuse. But also things like if you're in that position, you don't have much money, etc., you become kind of an unperson for a while temporarily. And again, all this could be fixed at the society-wide level, but Neoliberalism is a policy choice. That's what the capitalists want to do. This is why we need to end capitalism. But anyway, so you're out in the street. Do you have access to good facilities for example, dental care or just daily self-dental care? You know, brushing your teeth once or twice a day. Is that always possible? Anyway, long story short, the link between dental pain and dental problems and alcohol abuse is significant. All right, continuing. But the broader issue is that this messy reality is taking place against a backdrop of stratospheric rents and home prices. Low-income people, many of whom have pre-existing behavioral health struggles, get very little margin for error if they hope to remain housed. That is where the other elements of Schellenberger's argument come in. Revisiting the Zillow study. Since I have repeatedly cited the aforementioned Zillow study in the past, let's take a closer look at it. Schellenberger says the study's findings are, quote, more nuanced than others, including myself, have suggested. According to Fransicko's gloss on the study, quote, homelessness and affordability are correlated only in the context of certain, quote, local policy efforts and social attitudes, unquote. That is certainly not how I remembered the study's conclusion, so I revisited the paragraph Schellenberger is referencing, emphasis mine. Quote, because homelessness often appears to involve a jumble of factors that are difficult to tease apart, it can be useful to quantify some of the main factors. Rent affordability is one, as is the poverty rate. The model for this research also produced a baseline estimate for the homeless population in each market, the population that the model indicates might be homeless regardless of housing costs and the poverty rate. It's an informed but hypothetical statistical starting point in relation to the market's peers before considering other factors. Emphasis here. To that baseline, the model adds the effect of the poverty rate and rent affordability, as well as unknown and unobserved latent factors that could include everything from local policy efforts to social attitudes towards homelessness to the weather in a given locale. Each force can act as a headwind to push homelessness higher or a tailwind that pulls it down, unquote. Comment. Let me just add here, also, if housing were just simply treated as a right, you would have zero homelessness. It would be truly voluntary at that point, and it wouldn't be homelessness. You'd have people who, you know, voluntarily live the life of a transient or whatever, but it would no longer be this problem that people are experiencing that they don't want to be experiencing it, which was, of course, you know, Ronald Reagan back in the 80s when neoliberalism was really being aggressively laid out, made that statement that people who are homeless want to be, like it's a voluntary choice. Nothing could be further from the truth. Yes, you might have some free spirits who want to live in a van for a while or something, but that's entirely different from the phenomenon of homelessness. Continuing. Schellenberger is misreading the bolded sentence. The study's authors are not saying that the correlation between rent affordability and homelessness disappears when one controls for policy efforts and social attitudes. Quite the opposite, in fact. Their model included a variable meant to simulate the effect of these factors and found that differences in rent affordability still explained a significant amount of the variation in local homelessness rates. Public policy and social norms do matter. If they didn't, then there would be no reason for me to work on homelessness policy and write about it for a general audience. But these factors in no way eclipse the role of housing unaffordability in the Zillow study. By the way, it's generally a good idea for journalists who are confused about the findings of a report to contact the authors directly and confirm whether their interpretation makes sense. For example, I reached out to one of the economists who worked on the Zillow study and confirmed that my interpretation of the above paragraph, not Schellenberger's, was the correct one. The Zillow study is not alone. It is strange that Schellenberger devotes his attention exclusively to the Zillow study. A broader literature review would have uncovered a lot of corroborating research on the relationship between housing unaffordability and homelessness. For example, here's a chart from a 2017 report of Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies showing the correlation between rates of homelessness and median rents. The title is, "Homelessness is especially high in more expensive rental markets. You can see it there on the screen. Similarly, the below tweet includes charts from an upcoming book with the appropriate and pithy title, Homelessness is a Housing Problem. These are tweets from Clayton Page Aldern at Compatibilism from 2021 November. Why does a city like Seattle see 4 times the rate of homelessness of a city like Cincinnati? Colburn, Gregg, and I argue this kind of regional variation stems from differences in housing markets, and soon you'll be able to read the study via UC Press, and link to the book Homelessness is a Housing Problem. We focus on cities, not individual people, and when you take a metropolitan lens, rents and vacancy rates arise as some of the only credible explanations for regional variation in rates of homelessness, not poverty, not the generosity of public assistance, not drug use. So I want to comment here. This is from research in 2021. I have not read this particular book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem. However, in the 3 major causes of homelessness that I listed, gentrification, which has to do with the affordability of housing, is number 1. Now they're saying not poverty and not the generosity of public assistance. I wonder, the list that I cited had more to do with the rise of homelessness and changes in the overall economy, like the jobs aren't there, and basically it was, the beginning of neoliberalism, the assault on social democracy that had existed from the 1930s to the 1970s. I'm wondering if when they say not poverty and the generosity of public assistance, if this is kind of a question of now, 40, 45 years into neoliberalism, if what's mentioned as public assistance, in other words, the spectrum of what kind of public assistance is available today, is, the spectrum has narrowed so much by the time we're in 2021 that even, quote, more generous public assistance no longer fills the gap, as it might have done more so in the past. All right, continuing. The Zillow study is a valuable contribution to the body of economic work on homelessness, but it is neither the first nor the only study to find a significant relationship between homelessness rates and housing unaffordability. One wishes Schellenberger had dived a little deeper into the literature before writing a book purporting to rebut it. Comment: no, because that's something he would have done if he were actually interested in becoming educated on this subject. But that's not his goal. His goal is to run for governor on an anti-Gavin Newsom platform, and I'm not here to defend Gavin Newsom, but he is running on the Joe Rogan Fox News circuit, speaking to an audience and trying to rally a voting base that doesn't care about understanding these issues. He wants to play to their ignorance and prejudices, and that's exactly what he's doing. So, he's pretending to be an academic. The academics reject him, but really, these are all political things that he's doing, period. And that's what it's about. Continuing. Dubious comparisons. In the same chapter where Shellenberger misreads the Zillow study, he writes the following, emphasis his, quote, other cities, including Chicago, Houston, and the greater Miami area, saw typical rents increase 24%, 32%, and 35%, and the number of homeless decline 20%, 57%, and 9% between 2011 and 2019, which are the years covered by the Zillow study, 2011 to 2017, plus 2018 and 2019. In Nashville, the number of chronically homeless fell 54% in the same period, unquote. Elsewhere, he notes, quote, homelessness nationwide declined from 763,000 to 568,000 between 2005 and 2020. In the same 15-year period, the homeless populations of Chicago, Greater Miami, and Greater Atlanta declined 19%, 32%, and 43% respectively, unquote. His point is that increases in homelessness among the uber-liberal cities of the West Coast cannot be fully explained by housing costs or broader national trends. Comment: I mentioned that this is all political before. Again, it's get the liberals out. That's the message. And it's one entirely focused around Gavin Newsom and Schellenberger's gubernatorial run, as we will see when his Medium post continues. It's literally all about that. Resuming the article, a few thoughts about this line of argument. 1. I found it odd that Schellenberger chose 2005 and 2020 as his 2 reference years for looking at Chicago and the metropolitan areas of Atlanta and Miami. Between 2007 and 2009, the United States experienced the greatest collapse in housing prices of at least the past 60 years. He is ignoring a massive exogenous shock in between the 2 points that he examines. So comment, what happened? 2008, the global financial meltdown. People lost all kinds of money, couldn't make payments on their houses. Houses were going up on the market in like record numbers. All kinds of stuff happened. So the Schellenberger narrative just does not hold up. Continuing. 2, with the exception of the Miami-Fort Lauderdale metropolitan area, all of the other cities Schellenberger mentions as counterpoints to the West Coast experience score fairly well on Zillow's rent affordability index. So even though average rents in those cities may have been rising in absolute terms, they still fall below the threshold where Zillow's model predicts they would be associated with rapid increases in homelessness. So commenting on that, in other words, rents can go up, but if they were starting from a really low level and, possibly other factors like wages rise or something like that, then it doesn't reach the part where it's unaffordable. That's the point you have to be concerned about. Again, does Schellenberger care? No, it's just political. 3, another odd thing about Schellenberger's use of counterexamples is that all these cities have housing first style programs operating in them. Oh, here is an essay about Houston's, and there's a link there. 4, the reason for large studies that look at every metropolitan area in the United States is that individual cities will always deviate from what any model predicts, sometimes by a significant degree. For that reason, cherry-picking a handful of cities and looking at 2 arbitrary points in time for each is not particularly useful. 5, it's worth noting that the Zillow study specifically cites Houston as an example of a city that deviates from what the researchers' model would predict in interesting ways. Again, no one is denying that local conditions and public policy play a role. The question these studies are attempting to answer is about the overall significance of housing costs across all cities. Lastly, Schellenberger writes, quote, Palo Alto and Beverly Hills have mild climates and expensive housing, but don't have San Francisco's homeless problem, unquote. That is, to put it mildly, a wild comparison. San Francisco is the urban core of a major metropolitan area. Beverly Hills is an affluent community of fewer than 35,000 people on the western edge of its area's actual urban core, the city of Los Angeles. Similarly, Palo Alto is a wealthy South Bay suburb. It is bordered by the significantly poorer and more racially diverse city of East Palo Alto. A more reasonable, though still flawed, comparison would be between San Francisco, the LA metropolitan area, and Santa Clara County, which includes both Palo Alto and the major urban center of San Jose. Unfortunately, this comparison would not do much to help Schellenberger's argument, as Santa Clara County and Los Angeles both have significant homeless populations. And let me just comment by adding there, Beverly Hills is like one of the richest places around. It's an affluent community, as the article says, of fewer than 35,000 people on the western edge of its area's actual urban core. So one thing we know about people experiencing homelessness is that many work. Are there jobs out in Beverly Hills? What's the police situation like? Significant police presence driving out, quote, undesirables? Come on. It's so brain dead simple. Continuing. Or maybe housing affordability matters after all. Somewhat bizarrely, Schellenberger seems to abandon his commitment to framing homelessness as anything but a housing affordability issue deeper into San Fransicko. In a late chapter, after providing some back-of-the-envelope estimates of what it would cost to house everyone who is currently homeless in California, he asks, quote, but what can be done to prevent the homeless population from simply replenishing itself, unquote. The answer, as it turns out, is building more housing. Schellenberger goes on to note that, quote, California has the second highest cost of living in the country, unquote, largely because of the state's severe housing shortage and the resulting out-of-control housing costs. This is all true, although the implied connection between homelessness prevention and building more housing is a significant tension with what Schellenberger argues in earlier chapters. The book never resolves that tension, Perhaps that is because any attempt to do so would lead to the tacit admission that one of its core premises, that the homelessness crisis is first and foremost a substance abuse and mental illness crisis, is plainly wrong. End of article, and I couldn't agree more. So, all right, we've gotten a taste of Schellenberger. We've gotten also some inoculation against some of this bullshit from more of a data-based perspective from somebody who actually studies this for a living and who doesn't also have aspirations of being the California GOP's golden boy in the race against Newsom or whoever the next California Democrat is. So let's go back to Shellenberger's article, see if we can get through it. I thought we were making progress. In September, I buttonholed Governor Gavin Newsom in San Francisco and told him about CalPsych, explaining that it was a way to centralize psychiatric and addiction care. He told me, quote, "I look forward to talking more about it." When Joe Rogan asked me in October if I thought Newsom cared, I defended the governor, saying that I thought he did. What a good faith character. And again, this is like trying to couch the whole thing in like, actually I'm progressive. Oh, actually progressives are vandals. They ruin cities. Wait, which is it? Is it housing? Is it drug problems? Because these are at odds with each other. More of that upcoming in the next paragraph. But Newsom has failed to increase housing, refused to fight for universal health care, and has rejected the idea of a statewide psychiatric and addiction care system, choosing instead to double down on the same policies that created the homelessness crisis in the first place. As a result, chaos and suffering are increasing nearly everywhere in California, even in small towns. Half of all fires in California's cities are in homeless encampments, even though the unsheltered homeless are less than 0.005% of the state's population. Firefighters and EMTs revive, at great cost, fentanyl addicts, this is not the same thing, but okay, who overdose and nearly die, and then put the poor souls right back on the street again. And violent crime is rising because the police are understaffed and demoralized. California spends much more than other states on homelessness and mental illness, and yet has worse outcomes. Homelessness increased 31% in California over the last decade, while it declined 18% in the rest of the country. Recently, a drug-addicted 16-year-old girl, the age of my daughter, and possibly yours too, was allegedly raped repeatedly before overdosing on fentanyl in an open drug scene in downtown San Francisco. Comment: this could not be more blatant, egregious pandering to the fears of paranoid petty bourgeois in California, fearing, trying to cling to their conservative values and protect their family from the horrors of, it's just, this is like so tired. I don't know. But, maybe that's partly why he wound up in 9th place in the race. I don't know. I mean, this is pretty crude as far as these types of efforts go. He's laying it on extraordinarily thick. Why won't Governor Gavin Newsom take action to shut down the open drug scenes and restore order? And what must be done? In October, HarperCollins published San Fransicko, which assembles a significant body of evidence to show that what we call homelessness results primarily from untreated mental illness and addiction, not poverty and high rents. Comment: so, as the last article pointed out, he actually distorted the information about high rents and poverty, but then also sort of closes the book with talking about, making more housing. Well, why do you think making more housing matters? Does it have something to do with the cost, like the rents and things like that? So it's just contradictory. This guy's kind of a buffoon. I'm covering it because he wound up on Rogan. He has, gotten on TV before in, places like Fox News. Jordan Peterson is a just complete ass clown as well, yet got popular. You got to watch out for this stuff because you never know, capitalism barfs up all kinds of fascist shit when it's in crisis. And, will this guy be the next? In any case, I think he's pretty bad at doing this messaging. But he's certainly ambitious. So this is probably not the last we've heard of him. It's good practice. Even if Michael Shellenberger drops off the map tomorrow, it's good practice to understand these issues and how right-wing demagogues try to distort them. Continuing. That book, My reporting on Substack. Oh, I think this is actually on Substack, not Medium. Anyway, and my video interviews helped change the national conversation, for the worse. In mid-December of last year, San Francisco Mayor London Breed called for a crackdown on open-air drug dealing. Again, this whole, like, the open-air drug dealing. Also, what happened elsewhere on the West Coast? Another state, Oregon, decriminalized a lot of drugs to the panic of reactionaries everywhere. Can some of Schellenberger's rhetoric here and the overall push that he's doing to bolster his political campaign, can this be seen in the light of reaction to policies like this? And as kind of basically support for war on drugs, sort of, lock them up one way or another type of policies. All these homeless people, I can't stand it, and they're doing drugs. Can we do something about that? Is that a way to get these people off the streets and stop reminding us that this system is complete fucking garbage? Because I don't want to think about that, because I benefit from the system. So, I don't want to think about the human cost here. I want the human landfill somewhere else. I just want to throw my garbage away. I don't want to have to look at it after I've disposed of it. Lock them up. Get them out of my sight. That's basically what this comes down to. Continuing. Shortly after, I was invited to address the city's Commonwealth Club. But a few days before my Commonwealth Club talk, I discovered, and was the first to report, that Mayor London Breed had secretly and illegally created a supervised fentanyl and meth use site in United Nations Plaza in downtown San Francisco. The site was part of a new, so-called linkage center, the centerpiece of the mayor's plan to supposedly direct homeless addicts to rehab. But the site has only worsened open-air drug... Again, this fucking phrase, where is it coming from? Open-air drug use, drug dealing, and violent crime, and sent just a handful of people to rehab. Okay, no analysis of what actually happened, but okay, sure. The bottom line is that San Francisco city government has put the business interests of violent drug dealers above the needs of vulnerable 16-year-old homeless female drug addicts. Again, this is such a bad effort to do what he's doing. It's very crude. Continuing. When cities can no longer properly govern themselves, it is the role of the governor to intervene. But instead of using his State of the State address last week to lay out a vision for California, to realize its incredible potential. Oh, so this is another theme in his thing, is that technology is going to solve the climate crisis and stuff like that. Like, it's all about potential, technological potential, all of this stuff. Very typical. But anyway, Newsom was dehumanizing, disrespectful, and dishonest, and not just on the issue of homelessness. At a time when just 9% of African American students and 12% of Latino students in Los Angeles public schools are proficient in 8th grade math, Newsom began by patronizingly praising his appointees for their racial identities, sexual preferences, and immigration status, not their achievements. This is pretty hard to read. Hard why? Because it's dripping with hypocrisy. You can say, but he hasn't done these. Yeah, he hasn't been governor yet. He's not qualified to, and he never will be, hopefully. But this is like the problem with libertarians, for example. They will go on criticizing everything, throwing everything at the wall until something sticks. The problem is, what do they actually propose as the solution? Well, they're crypto-fascists. They hide it the best that they can, but it would be even worse than what's going on now. Not that what's going on now is good, but they have solutions worse than the problem. Continuing. In his speech, the governor talked tough on forest fires, even though he cut the budget for fighting them, and the area treated for fire prevention declined by half during his time in office. Newsom, anyway, it goes on, Newsom. You can see it on the screen. We have the highest income tax. Newsom this, Newsom becomes the focus of every single paragraph, and it just becomes a commercial for the gubernatorial run, really having little to do with, any kind of data-driven specifics. So this is the point where Schellenberger officially morphs from his earlier incarnation as heterodox, outside the box, maverick, cowboy, rebel, who's going to swoop in, shake things up in the environmental world, and then he's going to shake up our thinking on homelessness. Wow. This is the part where that just morphs into the naked right-wing power play that it always was conducive towards becoming. Lots of shock and awe, very little substantial content, and as one critic put it, even the few points that he and his co-authors raise that might be of some interest, that might actually inject some new insight into the situation, it's framed and presented in such a brash, obnoxious way that it's very hard to engage with it at all. Very typical of a future Rogan guest, though. You can see how he wound up on that show. Other critics are less kind. One person said of his work on climate change, or, his climate denial efforts, what's correct in this work is not new, and what's new in this work is not correct. So let's now turn to another critical evaluation of Schellenberger's San Fransicko bestseller. This is from the American Prospect by Peter Dreyer, dated March 18, 2022. Title of the article is Homelessness Meets Cluelessness. Michael Shellenberger applies conservative culture war cliches to the housing problem. Very apt summary, in my opinion. Again, this is a review of San Fransicko, Why Progressives Ruin Cities by Michael Shellenberger. And, interesting title, San Fransicko, Why Progressives Ruin Cities. Not do progressives ruin cities, but it's they do. Why do they do it? Okay. Americans love people who find redemption by acknowledging their sins, see the light, and change their lives. Michael Shellenberger claims to have once been a progressive. So commenting, we have another leaving the left story here. Yet another one of these people is like, oh yeah, I used to be a progressive, but then I, saw the light, put him in the Tim Pool, that whole category. I feel like people who do this, it's just, again, the whole thing is about pandering to frightened, ignorant right-wingers and trying to mobilize them for political power. Hence leaving the left. Nothing is more reassuring to people who have no idea what's going on in the world and, are stuck with the default ignorant right-wing opinions that are propagated by the very wealthy throughout the United States. And, that's a sad thing. But anyway, he's one of those clowns. So continuing, Michael Shellenberger claims to have once been a progressive, but that the failure of so-called progressive cities, particularly San Francisco, to solve the crisis of homelessness turned him into a conservative. Now, he's become an evangelist for conservatism. San Fransicko is his confession. Despite its many endnotes, this is not a scholarly book. The author distorts and misuses facts when it suits his arguments. San Fransicko is a tirade against permissiveness. Cities that allow homeless people to live and sleep on sidewalks, in parks, and tent encampments in residential neighborhoods and business districts, polluting those spaces with drug needles, urine, feces, empty bottles of alcohol, and unkempt people unmoored from reality. Schellenberger argues that homelessness is not primarily the result of poverty and the shortage of affordable housing. It is, he claims, really a problem of mental illness and substance abuse. Blame the victim. He blames what he calls, quote, pathological altruism, progressive municipal officials, and do-gooders who refuse to enforce vacancy laws, because that'll get to the heart of the problem, right? That would bring order and civility to urban streets. Schellenberger made a name for himself as a critic of the environmental movement for its opposition to nuclear power and fracking. In 2016, he started Environmental Progress, which launched campaigns to keep nuclear power plants in operation, testified in Congress in favor of nuclear energy, and worked with the Nuclear Energy Institute, an industry lobby group. In a TED Talk, Schellenberger argued that switching to renewable energy sources like solar power and wind is destroying the environment. In 2018, his unsuccessful campaign for California governor garnered only 31,692 votes. 3 years later, he backed Kevin Faulconer, San Diego's Republican former mayor, in his failed bid to unseat Governor Gavin Newsom. Then on March 10, he announced that he's running as an independent candidate against Newsom. No big city in America, whether governed by conservatives, liberals, or progressives, has solved its housing crisis. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's Out of Reach report, quote, in no state, metropolitan area, or county in the U.S. can a worker earning the federal or prevailing state or local minimum wage afford a modest two-bedroom rental home at fair market rent by working a standard 40-hour work week, unquote. So say that again, no worker making minimum wage in any state, metropolitan area, or county in the U.S. can afford a 2-bedroom rental. That is dismal. Continuing, rents have been rising faster than incomes, especially at the bottom half of the labor market. According to a report by Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, in 2019, the latest data available, more than 80% of renters earning less than $25,000 paid more than 30% of their incomes just to put a roof over their heads. Most paid more than half of their income for rent. Even 70% of renters earning between $25,000 and $35,000, and nearly 50% of renters earning between $35,000 and $50,000 paid more than 30% of household income for rent. Before the COVID pandemic, more than a quarter of all unhoused Americans lived in California, which has 12% of the nation's population. Almost 3/4 of the state's homeless people and 73% of San Francisco's 8,124 homeless residents are unsheltered, a higher share than in any other state. So just a comment there, there's a distinction here between somebody experiencing homelessness and then being sheltered versus unsheltered within that subset. So this kind of raises the question of what does homelessness look like? Because people's experiences of it are different. It can mean staying in a shelter. It can mean living in the streets, parks, and otherwise just outside in the elements. It can include squatting in an abandoned building. It can include living in a vehicle, which is obviously not meant for full-time permanent residence. I mean, in the case of a car, it's not meant for it at all. But, you know, if you go to, there's a YouTube channel, Invisible People. There's interviews with people who, you know, live in RVs and they don't want to be living in an RV. They'd rather be in an apartment or house, but it's not working out and the RV is better than nothing, but they're not really, you know, living the life. And an RV is really on the more generous end. A lot of people, you know, live in a car, a van, or an SUV, which, you know, really doesn't have any water, anything like that, and barely any space, and is just incredibly, you know, insecure. You can get robbed, broken into, all that kind of stuff. Not to mention heat, you know, other things like that, climate control in different seasons. It can include people living in a garage or a storage unit. In other words, you know, another type of structure which is not meant for residents. It can mean couch surfing, you know, sort of crashing on people's couches and things like that. Or, you know, sleeping on the floor in an apartment that is already at capacity with regard to the bedrooms, or some mix of these different statuses. So it's important when we think of people experiencing homelessness, it doesn't look the same for everybody. It's just important to keep that in mind. Continuing, California has the nation's highest housing wage, the income needed to afford a typical apartment. The typical monthly rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in California is $2,030. So a family needs to earn $39.03 per hour, $39 an hour, to avoid paying more than 30% of its income for rent. In San Francisco, that wage is $68.33. Typical of Schellenberger's disingenuousness, he writes that, quote, Palo Alto and Beverly Hills have mild climates and expensive housing, but they don't have San Francisco's homeless problem, unquote. Comment, we covered that before, but again, a statement like that can only come from somebody who is purposely trying to obscure the issue. But both are wealthy suburbs with few low-income residents who are likely to fall into homelessness. Contrary to Shellenberger's argument, a recent Harvard report found direct correlation between median rents and the size of the homeless population. So again, this is the same one that we looked at before. Continuing, the combination of low wages and rising rents leads many working people to wind up sleeping in their cars, on friends' couches, on the streets, or in shelters. A recent survey I co-authored of over 10,000 grocery workers in Southern California, the Seattle area, and Colorado discovered that 14% had been homeless during the previous year. Even 9% of full-time workers suffered that fate. That's a lot of people. 14% of 10,000 grocery workers in 3 states had been homeless. during the previous year. That's 1 in 7, 14%. Even 9% of full-time workers suffering that fate. So even if you're a full-time grocery worker, you got a 1 in 11 chance of being homeless at some point within the last year. That's the kind of economy we're dealing with. When we talk about socialism, people are like, what about productivity? What about, like, 1 out of 7 or 1 out of 11 grocery workers are fucking homeless? Like, we need grocery workers. This is a thing that people need to do. We need to somehow have grocery workers that aren't homeless. But this is the system. When people defend the current system, this is what you're defending. You're defending having a permanent underclass that is so precariously positioned with regard to housing. And, when your housing goes, it's like everything else goes. Because what's in your house? Your toilet, your shower, running water, your kitchen, all this stuff. And then if you can't cook your own food, your food costs go way up because you got to pay for prepared food. On and on. It's a spiral. It's expensive being poor. Even more so when you don't have access to, the stuff that you might have in an apartment. Actually, on that subject, here's something that even for people who do have an apartment, laundry. The amount of apartments that don't have laundry facilities in the building is incredible. I mean, I saw somebody talking about that. It's like there should be just a cap on, like, if the building does not have laundry in it, you shouldn't be able to charge more than like $700 rent or something. It's an enormous hassle having to go outside of your building to do your laundry. I mean, first of all, the, fistfuls of quarters, although that can also be the case in the building if you don't actually have it in your unit, which is like incredibly hard to find. But, and then all the time of sitting there and babysitting your clothing while it gets washed. Not to mention if you need to wash something like in the middle of the night, or just one thing or whatever it is, it's, very inconvenient to do that. You got to get dressed, get up, go do the thing. Hopefully you have a vehicle too, or it's within very close walking distance and you're in a safe area and it's okay weather outside and. So, that's just one example. So this system needs to go because of the position that it puts so many people in. Continuing, America's homeless crisis is not primarily a problem of personal pathology. The initial surge of homelessness in the 1980s resulted from the combination of closing the nation's mental hospitals without providing the promised funding for community-based treatment settings, and the Reagan administration's cuts in federal funding for low-income housing. When more low-rent housing was available, including many rooming houses, since lost to gentrification, even people on society's margins could afford a roof over their heads. So comment, those are two of the factors that we talked about in the beginning of the video. Also throw in deindustrialization and the overall shift, away from sort of unionized jobs in industry and things like that to more of the traditionally non-unionized, lower wage, lower benefit service sector jobs. Continuing. Contrary to Schellenberger's argument, San Francisco, like most California cities, has been run by business-friendly Democrats, not progressives. Since the late 1970s, San Francisco has only had one progressive mayor, Art Agnos, who served from 1988 to 1992. Most cities have pursued a strategy of promoting construction of new office buildings and hotels, often via tax breaks, to encourage high-tech, finance, insurance, healthcare, and tourism businesses. In other words, the only industries that still have money. The huge influx of highly paid employees, along with many low-wage workers, exacerbates the widening income divide. These cities also prioritize new luxury housing, hoping that the increase in supply will trickle down to help low-income renters find decent apartments. But that approach never works. Instead, rents trickle up as owners of existing properties raise rents closer to the levels of the newly built apartments. Landlords evict lower-income renters, many of whom wind up on the streets or in cramped and overcrowded quarters. A 2019 report found that 70% of San Francisco's homeless people once had a home in the city. 70%. That's not an anomaly, okay? That's the vast majority of people used to have a home in the city and they got pushed out of it. The only way to create new housing that secretaries, garment workers, daycare workers, janitors, nurses, school teachers, and hotel housekeepers can afford is to provide government subsidies to builders, homebuyers, and tenants. Comment, this is of course within a capitalist framing. If you throw out the capitalists and establish socialism, you don't have to deal with them at all. Cities don't have that kind of money, and Congress has not come close to restoring the federal HUD budget, that's HUD, Housing and Urban Development, to pre-Reagan levels. Today, only 1/4 of households eligible for federal rental assistance receive it due to funding limitations. Unlike food stamps, housing assistance, such as subsidized apartment buildings or housing vouchers, is not an entitlement. It is more like a lottery. In most cities, there are long waiting lists for housing aid, so long that many cities have stopped accepting applications. Most poor families are at the mercy of the private rental market. Shellenberger seems unaware of various state laws that preempt California cities' ability to address their housing crises. He decries California's, quote, high taxes, but doesn't even mention Proposition 13, a 1978 ballot measure that dramatically limited local government's ability to raise property taxes on homeowners, landlords, and businesses, depriving municipalities of revenues that they need for basic municipal services, let alone subsidies for affordable housing. Comment, note the timeline, 1978, late 70s, onset of neoliberalism. Nor does Schellenberger mention the Ellis Act, a 1985 state law sponsored by the real estate industry that allows landlords to evict tenants in order to remove housing units from the rental market. As California's housing market has heated up, speculators have abused the law by purchasing and then demolishing older buildings in order to build newer, expensive market-rate projects. Under the law, San Francisco has lost 4,576 rent-controlled units, while Los Angeles, with almost 5 times as many residents, has lost 27,000. For years, housing activists have tried without success to get the state legislature to repeal the Ellis Act. Even more glaring is Schellenberger's failure to mention the 1995 Costa Hawkins Act, another real estate industry-backed law that prohibits cities from regulating rents when a unit becomes vacant. This creates a perverse incentive for landlords to evict tenants, often by illegal means, including harassment, so that they can raise rents on new tenants. The result is a steadily declining number of apartments covered by rent regulation in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and other cities. Progressives have successfully pushed some cities to adopt inclusionary zoning laws and linkage policies to require developers to help to mitigate the cost of rising rents caused by market rate development, but these are band-aids, not fundamental solutions. In contrast, a coalition of Los Angeles labor, housing, and social service activists recently launched a campaign to increase taxes on real estate transactions over $5 million. This would raise over $800 million a year to fund permanent affordable housing and to provide emergency relief for renters at risk of eviction. The measure will go into effect if more than half of voters approve it on the November ballot. Shellenberger claims that, quote, homelessness exploded in California around 2009 after the state stopped making housing assistance conditional on sobriety. Holy shit. 2009. Gee, was anything going on in the economic realm in 2009? Clown. Total fucking joke. It's a total farce. But again, this is what gets you on the Joe Rogan show. Continuing, but he ignores the reality that California, like the rest of the country, was then reeling from the biggest housing crash since the Depression, a catastrophe caused by banks' reckless and illegal behavior. Comment, and also behavior, well, I guess this is covered by reckless, behavior that used to be illegal, and then deregulation made it legal again. Many middle-class and low-income people lost their homes. Echoing Reagan, Schellenberger argues that most homeless people are homeless by choice. Absolute fucking nonsense that's easily refuted, easily. He clearly just isn't interested in reality. He thinks that the poor, homeless, or addicted should make better choices, and progressives should stop making excuses for them by blaming their plight on broader economic and social forces. Comment, real quick, people who try to look at the system, at the material conditions, at the structure, this is fundamentally a more left-wing approach. People who try to blame individuals, blame the victim, not the system, that is more of a right-wing approach. Because, why? It diverts attention away from the system. The thing that class struggle struggles against. This is favorable towards the ruling class. The ruling class has set up a system that they benefit from. They don't want it questioned. They don't want it attacked. So turning the criticisms around onto the people who are oppressed by the system, that's basically move number one. Turn the spotlight away. And then failing that, they'll go into various apologetics and other things for the system. But, rule number one is blame the victim, turn criticism away at the root. Continuing. Schellenberger condemns housing first approaches that offer homeless people a secure roof over their heads without requiring them to first get sober or get treatment for mental illness. He wants local police to arrest homeless people who use drugs, abuse alcohol, and beg on the streets. Because, of course, the thing we need is more people in prison, right? Like, that's not already a massive crisis in its own right. But again, that's who this guy is. Okay, we've established that. Continuing. In fact, a growing number of cities have recently begun removing homeless people from encampments and other public spaces in response to complaints from business groups and local residents. Sort of shatters that illusion that all is well. When San Francisco Mayor London Breed announced a crackdown on street crime and drug dealing last December, Shellenberger claimed vindication. He even urges California to create a new agency, CalPsych, which would institutionalize people who live on the streets. To make his case, Shellenberger claims that European countries have moved away from progressive harm reduction approaches to utilizing arrests and mandatory treatment in dealing with people experiencing homelessness. But he gets that wrong too, as Maya Shalovitz and others have shown. Coerced treatment and criminalization don't work, said Laura Thomas of the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. Quote, "We don't have enough services, we don't have enough housing, we don't have enough shelter beds," unquote. Comment there, on the subject of shelters, there is also the question of conditions within shelters. So this is having enough services, enough housing, enough shelter beds. So number of shelter beds is one question. Conditions within shelters is another. Sometimes people experiencing homelessness opt to sleep outside rather than in a shelter because they can be so unsafe. It's not even just a question of safety. A lot of times there are rules at the shelter, like you can't leave your stuff, or just all kinds of various things. I read a really interesting ethnography of a researcher who went basically, quote, undercover in various shelter settings, and it was not Disneyland. These were not, a lot of people just legitimately feel safer in the out of doors, and not that that's a good situation, but it's in some cases preferable. Continuing, Shellenberger ignores the evidence that people with addictions and mental illness are more likely to improve their situations when they have unconditional access to stable housing. For example, that approach has cut chronic homelessness among military veterans by about half. Of course, housing first is easier to adopt in cities without sky-high rents, such as Houston, where the approach has been successful. For the 32% of unhoused Californians who are chronically homeless and whose plight is exacerbated by disabilities, the solution is stable housing with wraparound support services, according to a just-released study by the California Budget and Policy Center. Comment, okay, stable housing, wraparound support services, it's almost like having the basics plus a community is what people need. It's like neoliberalism is trying to reinvent the concept of society itself, or perhaps to commodify it. In recent years, Los Angeles has moved about 9,000 homeless people into hotel rooms, but the overall homeless numbers didn't decline because an even larger number of people fell into homelessness after getting evicted. The same is true in San Francisco, where the head of the city's Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing pointed out that for every person who exits homelessness, 3 fall into it. Schellenberger refuses to acknowledge that mental illness and addiction are often caused or at least made worse by being homeless. Losing your job, getting evicted, and winding up homeless and living on the streets or moving from shelter to shelter are traumatizing experiences. Similarly, as one research team recently found, quote, the association between homelessness and drug use is bidirectional, and homelessness itself plays a role in drug use and overdose risk, unquote. Consider West Virginia, which ranks first in drug overdose deaths and is ground zero in the opioid crisis. That state has one of the nation's lowest rates of homelessness, mostly because housing is inexpensive. The typical monthly rent for a 2-bedroom apartment was $771, and a housing wage of just $14.83. Religious zealots are not persuaded by facts and rational arguments. Schellenberger had a conversion experience, and now he wants to convert liberals and progressives to atone for their sins. Schellenberger, meanwhile, has violated one of the important commandments, thou shalt not lie. So that's the end of that article. And I pulled a couple of other articles, but we've already gone over an hour, and the other articles don't deal directly with Schellenberger. So I'll just do those tomorrow in a separate video, or whenever I do videos next, if not tomorrow. In closing, I'd like to mention a few things. First of all, I'd like to underscore the element of race in homelessness. We just covered this in the reply to Tim Black on the California slavery reparations video that is the last one that I uploaded prior to this. Go check that out. Which shows that 6.5% of California's population is African American, yet 40% of the unhoused population is African American. That's a six-fold overrepresentation, more than six-fold. So do African American people in California just, make more bad choices? I'm sure the conservatives would say yes. They'll say yes to anything that can blame the victim. Also, bonus points if it includes racism. But no, we're talking about systemic racism. And this is some of the fallout from that, is that black Californians are that much more likely to experience homelessness. So it's hard to take down every single element of the disingenuous farce that is Schellenberger's right-wing governor campaign, which is also masquerading as some kind of formal academic analysis. It's hard to do that in just sort of one introductory video, but hopefully I've gotten a decent start on it, and you out there in the audience can use this video as a jumping off point for either additional criticisms of Schellenberger or just additional work on the housing crisis in general. This is a hugely important issue that virtually no one in politics is talking about. It's really important. People are always asking, what kind of organization can I join? Because I say at the end of a lot of the videos, join an organization, because all the agitation and education in the world is only going to get you so far. You got to organize to actually bring change to the real world. Now, it's kind of hard in 2022 to find a large Marxist organization that's actually active in the community, has real ties to the community, is actively working on various issues. Most areas you're more likely to find something like DSA or the Green Party. Don't overlook it as an opportunity to get out there, network with people, try to pull it left. Avoid the Democratic Party. You can't pull them left. You'd be surprised what you can do in other groups. Yes, there has been a terrible shrinking back from actual socialism over the last 30 years. It's not good. And that was on top of an already anti-communist U.S. left, back to like the post-war period, basically. We now stand at a point where a lot of that older thinking is dying out figuratively and literally, and younger people in their teens, 20s, 30s, 40s can get out there and bring some new, fresh, more radical thinking to existing orgs, network with each other, form new orgs if that makes sense, whatever it is. But get out there, get working on the struggles that are in your community. That is how you get some momentum going and how you draw more working people into the struggle who aren't engaged in it currently, is you work on problems that are actually affecting their lives and show them, hey, we've got something going over here, join us. And definitely housing is a problem that is affecting the entire country. So it's a very, very reliable starting point. Look at any of the things that Bernie Sanders was talking about that resonated with tens of millions of people, or Occupy, etc. There are problems plaguing this country at a structural level. And again, they're worse in some areas, and in some areas, a particular issue is better, but another one's worse. But basically, there are some major fundamental problems. Get out there, see who else is working on things, and see how you can contribute. And then tomorrow, somebody else is going to be in your spot and joining up, and you'll be showing them the ropes. So let's get it going. We need to build this movement out in the real world. Anyway, what do you think? I'm going to wrap it up here. Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons as well, whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging. They are also materially helpful, so I really appreciate those. If you like this content, thank me. course, I'm the one who's actually recording it and uploading it and all that stuff, but also thank a patron, because I have been able to do a lot more content thanks to the patron support than I would have been able to do without it. So it does make a big difference. Also, thanks to everyone for engaging with the channel by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting on the videos in the channel. All of that helps to boost Socialism for All in the YouTube algorithm and helps more people to stumble across this content. We want to make it more accessible and easier for people to find, even people who don't know that they're looking for it yet. We want to make the content as readily accessible as absolutely possible, and your engagement does support those efforts. Even if you think it's a small gesture, do it. It helps. There are 7,000 people subscribed to this channel now. Everybody sharing one post or liking it, comment, it adds up, and the channel has been growing. And that's a help to everybody out there who has not stumbled across it yet, but it's another step closer to them doing that. So thanks again, and we will catch you in the next video.